Yes, okay. So as Jean was saying, we're going to be taking a journey this evening through the year in Anglo-Saxon England. And by that, I mean, we're going to be thinking about how the cycle of the year was experienced by people in this period in various different ways, really. So the changing of the seasons, the rhythms of agriculture, and the customs and feasts and religious festivals that kind of marked the stages in the passing of the year. And obviously to get the whole cycle of the year into one talk, into one journey, is a little bit of a challenge. So what I'm going to do is start off by giving a kind of overview of the Anglo-Saxon festival calendar and how that changed and developed in this important period, and then take you on a swift tour through some of the high points of the festival year, and with a special focus, as Jean requested, on the period that we're kind of in right now. So we are just after New Year, after the Winter Solstice. We've had 12th night, so we've had the end of the Christmas season, and here we are in January. So I'll talk a bit about kind of where we are in the Anglo-Saxon year later on. So the Anglo-Saxon period, the Anglo-Saxon period is a particularly interesting time in which to think about the history of the cycle of the year, because these centuries between, say, the 5th, 6th century and the 11th century saw a very important cultural change in thinking about time and the seasons. And that was a change that came when the Anglo-Saxons converted from paganism to Christianity. So at the start of this period, in, as I said, the 5th or 6th century, all the different kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England were pagan, and that meant they had their own religious calendar, of course, and their own festivals and their own ways of thinking about the seasons and the structure of the year. And that calendar was partly shaped by the agricultural conditions in Britain, and that obviously controls things like the timings of harvest and therefore harvest festivals. You know, those can vary depending on where you are. But it was also shaped by the cultural origins of the Anglo-Saxon settlers, many of whom had come to Britain from northern Germany and Scandinavia, and had close affiliations with Germanic and Norse culture. So theirs was very much a calendar formed by a northern European climate and landscape and culture. And then over the course of the 7th century, the different kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England gradually converted to Christianity. And then for the larger part of this period, Christianity was the kind of predominant, the official religion of what eventually became the Kingdom of England. And that religious conversion obviously brought many profound social changes. But one of the most important changes it brought was that it brought an entirely new calendar, and one that had grown up in a very different cultural context. So the Christian calendar had developed over the first few centuries of the church's history, with influence from the Jewish calendar on the one hand, and then also from the calendar in use in the Roman Empire, the Julian calendar. And at the time the Anglo-Saxons converted to Christianity, that calendar was already quite well developed. So the core structure, including the sort of two key festivals of Christmas and Easter, was already well established. That was in place. So the new religion, when it came to England, it brought lots of new feasts and festivals to celebrate, marking the life of Christ and the lives of various saints and martyrs. And that Christian calendar became firmly established in England in the Anglo-Saxon period. It kind of became part of daily life for everyone, basically. And it formed the basis of the festival calendar, which would then essentially be consistently observed in England for the next 1,000 years or more, right up to the present day. In essence, the calendar established in that period is still the basis of our own festival calendar. Christmas and Easter are still culturally the most important festivals in the British calendar. Even for people who don't observe them as religious festivals, they have that cultural importance. And they were both first celebrated in this country in the Anglo-Saxon period. Their names go back to Old English, the language of the Anglo-Saxons, so Christus Mass and Eostra, as they were in Old English. And that's also true of a big range of other festivals, which aren't so widely known today as Christmas and Easter, but were consistently celebrated from the Anglo-Saxon period up until just a few generations ago and to the middle of the 20th century. So for instance, Whitsun or Michaelmas or Lammas or Candlemas, all of those festivals are all found in Anglo-Saxon sources, and all of their names go back to Old English usage. So that element mass, like in Christmas, Lammas, Candlemas and so on, comes from the Latin mass or festival, but it was the Anglo-Saxons who started using it in that way in English. So the adoption of the Christian calendar brought all of these new festivals to England, and it also introduced new ways of measuring time. Such as the Roman system of months that we still use today, January, February, and so on. Those go back to the Roman calendar, but they were introduced to England in the Anglo-Saxon period, along with the conversion to Christianity, because that was the calendar used by the Roman Catholic Church. But at the same time that this new calendar was introduced and became established, the old pagan calendar wasn't entirely swept away by the conversion. Aspects of that calendar did survive in kind of modified forms, and so did some older ways of thinking about the cycle of the year. So what emerged was a quite distinctive and interesting blend, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. Okay, so what do we know about the Anglo-Saxon calendar from before the conversion to Christianity? The problem with answering that question is that almost all of our written sources from Anglo-Saxon England date from after the conversion. So our evidence from the pre-conversion period is quite limited, but we do have information about the calendar from one important source, the Anglo-Saxon historian Bede. So Bede was a monk in Northumbria. He's best known for his Historia Ecclesiastica, his history of the English church, which is a really important source for early medieval history. But Bede was interested in lots of different things as a historian. And one of the things he was most interested in was the calculation of time and the structure of the year and the way that the calendar is organized in different cultures. And in around 725, he wrote a book called De Temporum Ratione, on the reckoning of time. And in this, he talks about many different aspects of the calculation of time. He was writing from a Christian perspective, of course, but as part of his discussion, he includes a short chapter about how the year used to be structured among the English before they converted to Christianity. And in this chapter, he gives some very important information. So he says, in old times, the English people calculated their months according to the course of the moon. So that's, i.e., they had a lunar calendar. They began the year on the 25th of December, when we celebrate the birth of the Lord. And that same night, which we hold so sacred, they used to call by the heathen name Modranecht, that is Mother's Night. We'll come back to that. Mm-hmm. Originally, they divided the year as a whole into two seasons, summer and winter, assigning the 6 months in which the days are longer than the nights to summer and the other 6 to winter. Hence, they called the month in which the winter season began Winterfylleth, a name comprised of winter and full moon, because winter began on the full moon of that month. And he later says that that month is equivalent to October in our calendar. So he then goes on to talk about the names of the other months in the pagan calendar, which I'll come back to in a minute. First, I want to talk about this idea of the year only having 2 seasons, summer and winter. I think if you ask most people how many seasons are there in a year, they would pretty much all say 4. We kind of take that for granted. But it's not the case in every culture, and it wasn't originally the case in Anglo-Saxon England. So the very idea of a 4-season year, winter, spring, summer, autumn, only came to the Anglo-Saxons when they adopted the Roman calendar along with Christianity. And there is evidence to suggest that actually right through this period, the 4-season year was a rather niche, kind of learned way of thinking about the seasons, and not how most people would have thought about it, not how your average person would have thought about it. Most people seem to have continued thinking about the year as having 2 seasons, summer and winter, with the solstices, usually called midwinter and midsummer, logically, falling in the middle as the turning points of the year. And that's a way of thinking about the seasons that does make sense if what you're mostly thinking about is the agricultural cycle, because it means when they talk about summer, they mean the 6 months from the spring equinox in March to the autumnal equinox in September. So all of the time in which plants and crops are starting to grow and then kind of coming to fruition and being harvested. So that includes what we would think of as spring and summer and part of autumn, probably too, in September. And then winter is just the other half of the year, the cold, dark 6 months when nothing's really growing, and you pretty much just have to wait until summer comes and the season for growing crops starts again. When the Anglo-Saxons adopted the new calendar, some people did start to think in terms of 4 seasons. And at that point, they adopted a Roman system of dating for when the seasons begin and end. So by the end of the Anglo-Saxon period, this is a system of dates that appears in many calendars. And the transitions fall roughly halfway between the solstices and the equinoxes. So winter starts on the 7th of November, spring on the 7th of February, summer on the 9th of May, autumn on the 7th of August, probably quite a lot earlier than we would think of autumn beginning, but it is halfway between the summer solstice and the autumnal equinox. And by the later Anglo-Saxon period, they also had names for what we would call spring and autumn. And that's nicely illustrated by this extract from a poem from an 11th century manuscript, which includes this very brief description of each of the 4 seasons. So winter is coldest, spring frostiest, it is longest cold, summer sun brightest, the sun is hottest, harvest most glory blessed, it brings to men the year's fruits which God sends them. So you do have 4 seasons there, and they are kind of similar to what we would recognize, but they're not quite the same. I'm not sure that most people would immediately think of spring as the frostiest season. If you had to pick one word to sum up spring, I don't think most people would go for frostiest. But then if you think about it starting on the 7th of February, maybe that does make sense. And one interesting thing here is that we can see how the language used for summer and winter and the kind of the idea of those seasons has been very stable and very consistent over time. So the words for summer and winter have basically not changed in the 1,000 years since this poem was written. So you can see winter in the Old English and summer in the 3rd line there. But the names for the other 2 seasons, the kind of transitional seasons of spring and autumn, have changed quite a lot over time. So for the Anglo-Saxons, spring was Lencton, the word you can see on the first word of the 2nd line there. And Lencton comes from the same root as the word long and lengthen. So it suggests the season when the days are growing longer around the spring equinox. And then after the conversion to Christianity, that word Lengton also came to be used for the season of fasting before Easter, which became the origin of the word Lent. And right through the medieval period, right up into the 14th century, Lent actually continued to have 2 meanings. It meant spring, it was the only word for spring, and it also meant that time of fasting, which obviously always falls in the spring. And it was only quite late in the medieval period that people sort of began to distinguish, and they started to talk about the spring of the year, the kind of the beginning of the year, and that gradually became our term spring. And then that word Lent kind of narrowed its meaning to just mean the period of fasting before Easter. And then in a similar way, the word autumn only appears in English quite late in the medieval period. It's borrowed from French, ultimately from Latin. But before that, the season was always called in English harvest. There was no separate term for autumn. And that's partly because harvest was so hugely important in medieval society. That's one of the ways in which we today are probably furthest away from thinking about, from medieval ways of thinking about the cycle of the year. I think most people today, unless they work in agriculture, really don't think very much about the harvest season. Shops mostly sell the same food all the year round. We don't have to worry about kind of getting a good harvest in to lay in food for the winter months or anything like that. But in the Middle Ages, you had to have a good harvest if you were going to survive through the winter. And bringing in the harvest required a huge amount of really hard work. So it was by far the most important aspect of that season of the year in kind of August, September time. And our idea of autumn as a season includes quite a lot more than just harvest. We can talk about things like autumnal colours or an autumnal mood, and people will know what you mean by that. But there isn't really an equivalent for that in Anglo-Saxon culture. They just didn't have another word for it. But then again, in the late medieval period, in the 14th century, there was a shift where the word autumn was borrowed into English, and then the word harvest kind of narrowed its meaning. So it didn't refer to one of the 4 seasons of the year, but just to the period that what we would mean by harvest, the time when crops are actually being gathered in. So that's an example of how ideas about seasons and calendars and so on can change over time, even something really fundamental like how many seasons are there. And that's exactly the kind of cultural change that Bede was interested in, because he was living in the time when the older Anglo-Saxon way of thinking about the calendar was being in the process of being replaced by the Roman calendar. And he wanted to record what the former customs had been. So he tells us some other really interesting things about the pagan calendar. For instance, he gives us the names of the Anglo-Saxon months and gives an interpretation of what he thinks those names meant. And these names are just wonderful. So you can see some of them are linked to pagan religious practices. For instance, February, Bede says, was called Solmonath, which he interprets as meaning month of cakes, which they offered to their gods in that month. And then there are 2 months named after goddesses. So March and April are named after the goddesses Hreitha and Eostra, who were honoured in those months. And I'll talk more about Eostra later on. And then other names relate more to agricultural cycles or to kind of the natural world. So Thraimilka, May, was called that because in that month cattle were milked 3 times a day. And then I think maybe my favorite is the name for August, which is Weidmonath, the month of weeds, because they are very plentiful then. And then I mentioned Winterfylleth earlier, that when winter began on the first full moon of that month in October. And notice that the 2 months around the winter solstice and the summer solstice, they share a name. So December and January are Yola, and June and July are Letha. And they'd be distinguished as, like, December would be earlier Yola and January later Yola, something like that. And that really emphasizes how important the solstices were as turning points in the cycle of this year with 2 seasons. So Bede is the only source who records most of these names for us, and some of his suggested interpretations, some people have questioned them. Obviously, he was much better informed about this subject than we are, but it is possible that he was just guessing about what some of these names meant. And certainly we can say there would have been a kind of regional variation in the names of the months. So these might well have been names used just in one part of the country rather than across England. And we also know that they were falling out of use at the time that Bede was writing already, so in the earlier part of the 8th century, and they were being replaced by the Roman calendar and the names that we would recognise, so January, February, and so on. Really boring names, I think, by comparison to the Anglo-Saxon ones. So Bede's evidence is really fundamental to understanding the structure of the pagan Anglo-Saxon year. And then when we start to look at other Anglo-Saxon sources, we get a sense of how the cycle of the year changed and adapted as the Christian calendar became kind of embedded in Anglo-Saxon culture. So what I'm going to do now is to take a journey through the key points of the cycle of the year and look at how this pagan calendar described by Bede evolved into an English version of the international Christian calendar that was shared across the medieval church. So the natural place to start our journey is the beginning of the year, which means the winter solstice for the Anglo-Saxons, midwinter. That was just a few weeks ago, wasn't it? And Bede says that the Anglo-Saxons celebrated the beginning of their year at midwinter, at the solstice. And that actually continued for a long time. So the Roman calendar started the year on the 1st of January, which is why we start the year on the 1st of January. But actually quite a lot of Anglo-Saxon sources treat the 25th of December as the beginning of the year, right through the period. And that kind of makes sense because, you know, once it became the feast of Christmas, it was more obviously important than the 1st of January. So Bede mentions a pre-Christian midwinter festival on the 25th of December, as we saw earlier, and he calls that Modranecht, which means Mother's Night, which is such an interesting name. We don't know anything more about it other than the date and this association with mothers. So we can only really speculate what it might mean. But maybe was it celebrating a group of mother goddesses? Maybe something like that seems possible, but we don't know. We know the name of another Anglo-Saxon midwinter festival, Yola, which was, as we saw, was apparently a name for the winter solstice. And that gave its name to the months equivalent to December and January. And again, we don't know, we just don't have enough information to tell us how that might have been celebrated in pre-Christian England. We don't know anything about customs associated with the day, for instance. But as a word, as a name, Yola did survive into the Christian period, and it was adopted as a name for Christmas. So that is where the word Yule comes from, as in Yuletide, and so on. And then the most common Anglo-Saxon name for Christmas actually seems to have been midwinter, more common than the Old English word Christusmas, which is the origin of Christmas. Anglo-Saxon writers often refer to Christmas Day as Midwinter's Day, or Midwinter's Mass Day, the festival of midwinter. And that parallels the usual name for the summer solstice, which they call midsummer. So it might be that midwinter and midsummer were also originally pre-Christian names for festivals marking the solstices, which were then kind of transferred to the Christian festivals, which were linked to the solstices in the medieval church. And in the early medieval period, the solstices and equinoxes did play a very important role in the development of the Christian calendar and in medieval Christian understanding of the cycle of the year. I think today people often think of solstices and equinoxes as kind of mostly a pagan thing, but they do have meaning in the Christian calendar too. So ever since the 4th century or thereabouts, so quite a long time before the Anglo-Saxon conversion, Christmas had been celebrated in Rome on the 25th of December, which was the date of the winter solstice in the Roman calendar. And the winter solstice was deliberately chosen as a day to celebrate the birth of the creator of light. So Bede gives a nice summary of medieval, sort of general medieval thinking about this when he explains how the Christian year was linked to Christmas and the winter solstice, but also to the summer solstice and the equinoxes as well, through the feasts of Christ and John the Baptist. And he says, very many of the church's teachers recount that our Lord was conceived and suffered on the 25th of March at the spring equinox, and that he was born at the winter solstice on the 25th of December. And again, that the Lord's blessed precursor and Baptist was conceived at the autumn equinox on the 24th of September and born at the summer solstice on the 24th of June. To this, they add the explanation that it was fitting that the creator of eternal light should be conceived and born along with the increase of temporal light, and that the herald of penance, who must decrease, should be engendered and born at a time when the light is diminishing. So he's saying that the birth of Christ is celebrated in midwinter, when the sun's light is reborn, because he's the creator of eternal light. And his conception was commemorated 9 months earlier at the spring equinox, when the days become longer than the nights and light triumphs over darkness. So that became the Feast of the Annunciation on the 25th of March. That's Lady Day, as it's sometimes called. And that was also thought in the Middle Ages to be the historical date of the crucifixion, which is why Bede says that Christ was conceived and suffered on that day. And then the summer solstice and the autumnal equinox were tied to the conception and birth of John the Baptist, the herald of Christ. The feasts of John the Baptist are some of the oldest in the Christian calendar, and they have a kind of special status because John the Baptist is the only saint in Christian tradition, other than the Virgin Mary, to have feasts commemorating his conception and birth, as well as his death. And his birth is significant because the Gospels tell the story of his conception, and they tell about the first meeting between Christ and St. John when they were both still in the womb, because their mothers were pregnant at the same time. So their births are connected in that way. And that meant that early in the development of the Christian calendar, they were celebrated at these 4 key points of the solar year. Christ conceived at the spring equinox, born at the winter solstice. John the Baptist conceived at the autumn equinox, born at the summer solstice. And Bede links this symbolism with John's words when he said of Christ that he must increase and I must decrease, because the prophet has to give way to the Messiah, just as the light of the sun increases after the winter solstice and decreases after the summer solstice. So the solstices, which were turning points of the year for the Anglo-Saxons before the conversion to Christianity, took on this new meaning with the coming of the new calendar, new religion. And calling Christmas Midwinter's Day suggests a really powerful link between the feast and the season, suggesting what it means to celebrate the rebirth of light in the darkest time of winter. And that's really important because winter is a season which looms very large in Anglo-Saxon culture, more than any other, really. I mentioned earlier, of course, the Anglo-Saxons lived in Northern Europe, where it is cold and dark for a very long period of the year, as we all know. And of course, they didn't have electric light, they didn't have very good heating. Their food supply was dependent just on what they could store through the winter. So it could be a very long and very difficult season. And that comes across very clearly in Anglo-Saxon poetry, where winter is a season that carries a real sense of threat and fear. And quite a lot of Old English poems talk about winter and wintry landscapes and the effect, the kind of psychological effect of winter on human beings. They often talk about it as a time when the earth is held captive, chained by the fetters of frost, as they say, or when snow kind of binds the earth, traps the earth. So there's a lot of this imagery of imprisonment and binding in Anglo-Saxon poetry about winter. And a real sense of of the earth being trapped because nothing can grow, but also human beings being trapped because we can't, we're sort of stuck in our homes in the winter. So there's a sense of confinement. And they very much think of winter as a time of hardship, which you just have to endure and survive and wait until the spring comes again. I mean, I think we know how that feels in January. So I wanted to talk about one quick example of this, which is from a poem called The Wanderer. And this is a poem about a man who's become displaced from his home after some kind of warfare and the death of his kinsman. So he's mourning his friends and the Lord he used to follow, who he loved very much. And in this poem, he laments his grief for his friends, and he sort of reflects on grief more generally as part of the human experience. So it's very much a poem about grief and loss. And that sense of loss is evoked through the language and imagery of winter. So he tells us that he's journeying all on his own across icy seas. And he says, I buried my Lord in the darkness of the earth, and from there journeyed winter sorrowful over the binding waves. He who has experienced it knows how cruel sorrow is as a companion for him who has few beloved friends. The path of exile holds him, not twisted gold, a frozen spirit, not the glory of the earth. So it's as if kind of winter's got inside his heart somehow. He says he's winter carey, so winter sorrowful, as desolate as winter. And he has a frozen spirit, kind of numbed by grief. And he then goes on to imagine a kind of apocalyptic picture of a winter which will one day destroy the whole world. So he talks about imagining human dwellings covered with snow, beset by frost and hail. Snow falling fetters the earth, the tumult of winter. Then dark comes, night shadows deepen. From the north comes a fierce hailstorm, hostile to men. So it's as if winter kind of symbolizes an existential threat to human happiness. And this is really quite typical of how winter is presented in Anglo-Saxon literature, often with this association with grief and suffering and even apocalyptic destruction. So I think we could say this is very much a Northern European way of thinking about winter. And in Scandinavian mythology, if you know anything about the stories of the Norse gods, a terrible and protracted winter was one of the signs that was supposed to come before Ragnarok, the end of the world, the doom of the gods. So it might be that the Anglo-Saxons once had a kind of related myth about a real apocalyptic winter. But the Wanderer also talks about how this kind of suffering, these kinds of winters, can lead to wisdom, because it leads us to focus on what is eternal and unchanging, rather than the transient things of this world, like wealth and earthly attachments and so on. And it says, so this earth every day declines and decays, and so a man cannot grow wise before he has had his share of winters in the world. Winters in the World is the title of my book, which I'll plug properly later. So in Old English, winters in the world, it's partly just a poetic way of counting years. So you could say that someone has lived 30 winters in the world. So this is partly saying, you grow wise when you've lived a certain number of years. Wisdom comes with age and experience, just through living through time. But then because winter in this poem and in lots of other Anglo-Saxon poems really kind of represents a season of suffering and hardship, the phrase also suggests that, your share of winters is your individual portion of trouble and grief. And everyone has a share of suffering, but we can all learn something and grow wise through seasons of winter in our lives. And so, okay, if winter's such a difficult season, that's why you need midwinter festivities and festivals and so on to bring light in the darkness. So let's talk a bit about the medieval Christmas season. So the Christmas season in the Middle Ages had quite a different shape from what we would recognise today. The festivities all started later because in Advent, so the weeks leading up to Christmas, people were fasting in preparation for the festival. So they didn't start celebrating in November, as some people do today. The celebration started on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day itself. And then you had the 12 days of Christmas up to Twelfth Night on the 5th of January and the Feast of the Epiphany on the 6th of January. And the Anglo-Saxons called Twelfth Night Twelfthmas, which is just lovely. So you could have Christmas and Michaelmas and Lammas and Candlemas and Twelfthmas. And the 12 days of Christmas were an official holiday for everyone. So it was stipulated in Anglo-Saxon law that people were supposed to be on holiday all through the 12 days of Christmas. And that obviously because it was a time to celebrate Christmas, but it was also a time when people couldn't really do much work anyway, because this is the time around the winter solstice when the days are very short, there's little daylight, the ground is very hard, it's usually really cold, so nobody wants to be working in the fields. There's not much you can do in terms of useful work outdoors at that time of year. So it makes sense for everyone to be on holiday. And then those 12 days of holiday culminated with Twelfth Night. And Twelfth Night used to be a really big deal, a time of real festivity and fun, because it was the last opportunity for sort of feasting and celebrating before you were supposed to get back to work. Technically, the medieval Christmas season lasted all the way through January for 40 days. So even though people went back to work after Twelfth Night, all of January was really supposed to be a month of feasting, not fasting. So again, it's kind of the opposite of how we do it, because now people go on a diet in January, or they do dry January or something. They're fasting in some way. But in the Middle Ages, they were still feasting. And a lot of sort of older traditional customs for this time of year carry on right through January, actually. So up to Twelfth Night and even afterwards. So we don't know very much about how the Anglo-Saxons celebrated Twelfth Night, but there are some really interesting customs associated with this time of year in kind of traditional folk culture, ways of starting off the new agricultural year. And these do go back quite a long way, definitely as far as the later Middle Ages. So, for instance, there's the tradition of wassailing, where people would sing to apple trees and toast them with cider, all in the hope of making them produce a good harvest in the next year. And wassailing goes back to the Anglo-Saxon phrase was hail, be healthy. So it's kind of wishing health to the trees. And wassailing is often done at Twelfth Night, and often actually done at Old Twelfth Night. So Old Twelfth Night is Twelfth Night according to the Julian calendar, which is actually today, the 17th of January, which is why I had to mention it. And then you have other customs like Plough Monday, which is the first Monday back at work after Twelfth Night, so after the Christmas holidays, so sometime around the second week in January. And what people would do on Plough Monday is they would bless and decorate a plough and then parade with it sort of through the village or something, with singing and dancing and sometimes mummers plays and things like that. So it's another New Year custom, marking the end of the Christmas holidays and sort of the return to ordinary work. So for a lot of people today, essentially Christmas is over by the beginning of January, but in the Middle Ages and right up into the 19th and 20th century, January was all very much part of the Christmas season, and that makes sense because it can be quite a bleak and depressing month, so it's kind of nice to find fun things to do at this time of year. And then the real end of the medieval Christmas season came on the 2nd of February with Candlemas, which was the last festival of winter, but also the first festival of spring. So Candlemas is the Anglo-Saxon name for what's called the Feast of the Presentation, which commemorates an event 40 days after Christ's birth, when he was taken by his parents to the temple in Jerusalem to be presented in the temple in accordance with Jewish law. And they were met by an elderly man and woman, Simeon and Anna, who recognized the baby as the Messiah they had been waiting for. And Simeon took the baby in his arms, as you can see in that image from an Anglo-Saxon manuscript, and hailed him as a light to lighten the Gentiles. But also he prophesied the child's future suffering and death. So to commemorate this, in medieval culture, people would bring candles to church to be blessed and then carry them in procession. So that's where the name Candlemas comes from. So it's very much a transitional festival. It looks back to Christmas, but also forwards to Easter. And at its heart is this meeting between childhood and old age, you know, very tiny baby and a very old man, between birth and death and winter and spring. And if you remember that spring began on the 7th of February, that's just a few days after Candlemas, that means you're midway between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. So it's a time when the days are getting longer, the first spring flowers are just starting to appear. So kind of a natural time for a festival of lights and kind of the hope of early spring at that point in the year. Okay, so let's go very quickly through the rest of the year. Got a lot of year still to get through. So after this, obviously, we move on to Lent and Easter. So Lent, the time of lengthening days, and then Easter. And so Lent could start quite soon after Candlemas and the end of the Christmas season in the Middle Ages, obviously depending on the date of Easter. For the medieval church, spring was very much a time of fasting, much more strictly than today. And spring was a good time for a fast because that was the time at the end of winter when food supplies were kind of running low anyway, after the winter, before more food could be grown. So there was kind of a practical reason for a collective fast, as well as it being a way of preparing spiritually for Easter. And so like Christmas, Easter was already a part of the Christian calendar when the Anglo-Saxons converted to Christianity. The date of Easter, which is linked to the first full moon after the spring equinox, had already developed as a way of reconciling the Jewish calendar, which governs the date of Passover, the time of Christ's death in the Gospels, with the Christian calendar and the solar cycle of the Julian calendar. So that had already kind of been worked out already. But there is one important Anglo-Saxon influence on the date of Easter, and that's to do with the name that the festival has in English. So in many European languages, what we call Easter has a name relating in some way to Passover, because so the date of Easter and also the names that it has in lots of languages all go back to kind of medieval Christian interpretations of Passover and references to Passover in the Bible. But the English name of Easter is unusual because it doesn't have anything to do with Passover. Bede talks about this when he explains the Anglo-Saxon name for the month of April, which was, as we saw earlier, Easter Monath. And he says, April has a name which is now translated Paschal month, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs named Estra, in whose honour feasts were celebrated in that month. Now they designate the Paschal season by her name, calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honoured name of the old observance. So this is all that any Anglo-Saxon source tells us about a goddess called Estra. And a lot of myth and speculation has been built on this very brief passage, such as the image that you can see here, which is a kind of modern imagining of Easter. So in the 19th century, scholars of comparative mythology argued that Easter was maybe a goddess of spring or the dawn, maybe celebrated at the spring equinox, and they theorized that she might be connected to symbols that we associate with Easter today, such as eggs and hares. And you'll quite often hear this repeated today. It kind of goes around the internet around Easter time. There isn't actually any Anglo-Saxon evidence to support it. It's a theory. We don't have any evidence for customs or rituals or symbols associated with Easter in Anglo-Saxon England. We know nothing about her except what Bede says here, essentially. And no suggestion that eggs and hares were particularly associated with Easter in the Anglo-Saxon period. And there are some scholars who don't even believe there ever was a goddess called Estra. They think maybe Bede just made her up to explain a name that he didn't understand, which might be going a bit far. But we can't really say anything about how the Anglo-Saxons might have celebrated Estra. But what we do see is that the name seems to have been quite straightforwardly transferred from the pagan festival to the Christian festival, just like Yola became Yule, Christmas. And apart from Bede, all other Anglo-Saxon references to Easter relate to the Christian festival and the very dramatic church services which would commemorate it on Maundy Thursday and Good Friday and Easter Sunday itself. And then after Christmas and Easter, there were numerous other moments in the festival year where the church calendar was kind of interwoven with the agricultural cycle. So in the summer, for instance, you have Rogation Tide, the days leading up to Ascension Day. So that's 40 days after Easter, which means that the Rogation Tide normally falls sometime in May. And the Rogation days were marked by processions in the countryside to bless the growing crops and pray for a good harvest. And these were big communal processions in which the whole community would get involved. Everyone would get time off work to kind of walk out together. And their Old English name is the Gang Days, which means the walking days. So people they'd process out of one church to sort of other notable places in the landscape. They'd carry holy objects like crosses and saints' relics, and they would bless the fields and orchards and pray for a good harvest. But from Anglo-Saxon descriptions of these processions, they do seem to have been quite fun, actually. I mean, obviously they had a serious purpose in praying for the harvest, but people seem to have been just enjoying themselves, going for a nice walk in the summer countryside in May. You know, it's a lovely time to go for a walk with other people. And then after that would come Whitsun, Pentecost, in May or June. And Pentecost, again, is tied to the church calendar. It commemorates the descent of the Holy Spirit to the disciples, as you can see in that Anglo-Saxon illustration. But it became just a popular summer festival, a time for baptisms, coronations, but also just about any other kind of summer festivity that people wanted to celebrate. And the traditional English name Whitsun goes back to the Anglo-Saxon name Whita Sunnunday, so White Sunday. Probably referring to the white garments that people would wear when they were being baptized. And Whitsun, as I said, it became a kind of just a day for general summer festivity, not really related to the religious festival. And right up into the 20th century, Whitsun was, for many people, the main summer holiday of the year, when many people would take their holiday. Eventually it became a bank holiday, and you would have kind of Whitsun fairs, Whitsun games, Whitsun parades, things like that. And then that was the case up into the 1970s. Some of you might remember this, when the summer bank holiday was fixed to the end of May rather than the movable date of Whitsun. And so that connection between Whitsun and the summer holiday was kind of lost and is kind of forgotten today for many people. Then next in the calendar, we get Midsummer in June, so the summer solstice. The longest day of the year, the time of maximum light before the days start to get shorter again. I said earlier that Midsummer was the feast of the nativity of John the Baptist, so it was called St. John's Eve, Midsummer Eve. And in the Middle Ages, it was a really important festival in Britain, as it still is in some European countries today. And the traditional way of celebrating it was with bonfires. So big communal fires on hills and high places, as if kind of echoing the fiery power of the sun at that time of year. And midsummer was thought of as a time when plants and herbs were especially potent. So Anglo-Saxon texts often say that Midsummer Day is the best day to gather herbs and things if you want to use them in medicines and remedies. And that's an idea which lasted for a really long time. That's where St. John's wort gets its name, because it was gathered on St. John's Eve, midsummer, and was used to decorate houses at that time because it was thought to have kind of powers of healing. So that's the summer. And then after midsummer, you're quite quickly into the harvest season, and festivals to mark that. So the Anglo-Saxon harvest season began in August with the festival of Lammas. The name Lammas comes from the Old English hlafmassa, literally loaf mass or bread mass, celebrating the first fruits of the wheat harvest. And this seems to have been a day when loaves of bread were made from the first harvested wheat and blessed. And one interesting little Anglo-Saxon text describes how you can use the loaves of bread blessed at Lammas to protect your harvested sheaves of wheat. It says that if you crumble bits of blessed Lammas bread around the four corners of your barn and you say the right prayers, then the mice won't be able to nibble at your harvested crops. And harvest continued into September. So there are two recorded Old English names for September. It was called Harley Monath or Harvest Monath, Holy Month or Harvest Month. And it may well have been holy originally in the pre-Christian period because of some kind of rituals to celebrate the end of the harvest, maybe sacrifices to the gods or something like that. So you celebrate the beginning of the harvest at Lammas and the end of the harvest in September. And as I said earlier, harvest was just incredibly important in medieval society, involving many, many people. So it really was a major part of life in August and September. And in the Christian era, September was also the time for the festival of Michaelmas, the feast of St. Michael the Archangel, on the 29th of September. So that's just after the autumnal equinox. And St. Michael was very popular in the Middle Ages, including in Anglo-Saxon England. He's usually shown slaying the devil in the form of a dragon, as in this Anglo-Saxon manuscript. And that really suited the Anglo-Saxon love of dragon slayers. You know, Beowulf and their heroes were often dragon slayers. And Michaelmas was also, so it was the most important feast kind of in that autumnal quarter of the year. And it was often a day used for administrative purposes too. So a day, for instance, when people might pay taxes or contracts and legal agreements would start, or when patterns of work would start to change as the agricultural cycle moves out of the harvest season and into sort of the early part of winter. And then finally, we head back into winter, and there's Martinmas on the 11th of November, so the feast of St. Martin of Tours. And in the Middle Ages, this was known for being the day when pigs and cattle would be slaughtered so that their meat could be preserved and stored through the winter. And that's a tradition found across Europe. But in Anglo-Saxon England, it seems to have replaced a pagan custom, which Bede talks about in Blot Monath, which is the name for November. Blot Monath means month of sacrifices. Bede says that cattle would be sacrificed then in the pre-Christian period, and probably for the same reason, so that their meat could be stored through the winter. So the religion changes, but the agricultural calendar, the needs of the community stay the same. And that brings us full circle, just in time, back to winter again. So all of this is a reminder of how important natural cycles continue to be to the festival calendar, whether Christian or pagan. That fundamental connection to cycles of growth and harvesting, lengthening and shortening days continue to be absolutely vital. And I wanted to end with just a little bit of poetry appropriate for where we are right now in the cycle of the year. So as I was saying earlier, at the moment we are in between Twelfth Night and Candlemas. So we're in January, kind of not still technically in the Christmas season. It probably doesn't really feel like it. It feels instead very cold and wintry. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of the Anglo-Saxon poetry about winter is quite depressing. It's focused on sort of the hardship of winter, even maybe apocalyptic destruction and things like that. But I wanted to end with a more hopeful extract about winter from an Old English poem called Maxims 1. And this is an example of Anglo-Saxon wisdom poetry. So a collection of inherited wisdom statements, proverbs, advice, kind of observations about the nature of the world, and so on. And among all of that proverbial wisdom, we get these lines: frost must freeze, fire burn up wood, the earth grow, ice build bridges, water wear a helmet, wondrously locking up shoots in the earth. One alone must unbind the frost's fetters, God most mighty. Winter must turn, good weather come again, summer bright and hot. So there again, we have that image of the fetters of frost. You know, winter is a time of imprisonment and constraint. But there are some nicer things about winter here as well. You know, I like the idea of ice building bridges, kind of creating these new structures where nothing was before. Or the idea of water wearing a helmet. This kind of is nice to think about that fluid moving thing that is water. It's kind of suddenly covered by something very solid, ice or helmet. And there's a sense of that kind of marvelous quality of transformation that winter can bring to a landscape when you suddenly get snow or frost or something, and it's like everything is transformed. And there's also a promise, importantly, that even though winter might feel endless, it will end, because the cycle of the year will keep turning, another season will take its place. Frost must freeze, fire must burn, they act out their nature, they perform their role in the world. And in the same way, winter must be replaced by summer as the cycle of the year goes on. So I think at this point in the year, that is a very good thing to remember, to hold on to, and a good note to end on. Thank you very much.